December 25th, 1776. A ragged army of farmers, blacksmiths, and teenagers is about to cross an ice-choked river in the dead of night, starving, freezing, half of them without proper boots, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. By every rule of war, they should have already lost. But that night, 12 men were about to pull off one of the greatest military gambles in American history and save the United States of America before it was even a year old. Let's set the stage. It's the fall of 1776. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed months earlier, and Americans dared to call themselves free. But that freedom was already slipping through their fingers. General George Washington had just suffered one humiliating defeat after another. New York was lost. His army was collapsing. Thousands of soldiers were going home because their enlistments were about to expire. The most powerful military machine on earth, the British Empire, was closing in for the kill. Historians agree, by every conventional measure, the American Revolution was about to die in the winter of 1776. But what happened next would become the turning point of the entire war. A desperate gamble, a daring river crossing, a surprise attack that would shock the world and prove that American grit could outsmart British power. This is the story of how 12 days in December 1776 saved the United States of America. To understand the miracle of Christmas night, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten. After the disastrous Battle of Long Island in August, Washington's Continental Army had been pushed out of New York City, defeated at White Plains, and humiliated at Fort Washington, where nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in a single day. It was one of the worst defeats in American military history. Washington's army, once nearly 20,000 strong, was now a shrinking, starving column of men retreating across New Jersey. British General William Howe and his Hessian mercenaries chased them the entire way, confident that the rebellion was all but finished. Thomas Paine, marching alongside the retreating army, would soon write the words that captured the moment perfectly. These are the times that try men's souls. By December, Washington had crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania with barely 3,000 men left, hungry, sick, and many without shoes. Enlistments for most of the army were set to expire on December 31st. If Washington didn't do something dramatic and fast, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. Not defeated in battle, just gone, evaporated, everyone walking home before the new year even began. The British, meanwhile, were so confident the war was basically over that General Howe pulled his main army back toward comfortable winter quarters in New York, leaving a chain of outposts scattered across New Jersey to mop up whatever remained of the rebellion once spring arrived. One of those outposts sat in a small town called Trenton, garrisoned by roughly 1,500 Hessian soldiers. Elite German mercenaries fighting for the British crown, feared across the colonies for their discipline and ferocity in battle. No one, not the British, not the Hessians, and honestly not even some of Washington's own officers, believed the broken American army was capable of attacking anyone. That is exactly what Washington was counting on. Put yourself in George Washington's boots for a moment. You are 44 years old. You have already lost more battles than you have won. Newspapers back home are questioning your leadership. Some members of Congress are quietly whispering that maybe someone else should command the army. Your own soldiers are deserting by the dozens every single week, walking home to their farms because they simply have nothing left to give. You have no navy. You have almost no money to pay your men. Winter is closing in, and the enemy outnumbers you, outguns you, and outsupplies you in every possible way. This is the position George Washington found himself in during those cold, desperate weeks of December 1776. And yet somehow, in the middle of all that despair, he found the clarity to plan the boldest attack of the entire war. Washington needed a victory, not just any victory. He needed something dramatic enough to save the revolution itself. Congress was fleeing Philadelphia. Morale was collapsing. The world was watching to see if America could actually fight, or if this whole experiment in liberty was about to die in its cradle before it ever truly began. So Washington devised a plan so bold it bordered on reckless. Cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a brutal winter storm, and launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn, when the enemy would least expect it. Christmas was deliberate. Washington knew the Hessians, like most European armies of the time, treated the holiday as an occasion for celebration, food, and drink. He was betting everything on the simple idea that no one attacks on Christmas. The plan called for 3 separate crossings, converging on Trenton from different directions to trap the Hessians in a pincer movement. It required perfect timing, brutal marching through a nor'easter snowstorm, and absolute secrecy. Washington chose a password for the operation that revealed exactly what this mission meant to him and his men: victory or death. Not victory or retreat. Not victory or survival. Victory or death. There was no plan B, and there was no turning back. On the night of December 25, 1776, roughly 2,400 American soldiers began crossing the Delaware River in Durham boats, flat-bottomed cargo vessels never designed to carry men, horses, and artillery through a storm like this. The conditions were almost unimaginable. Sleet turned to snow. The river was choked with jagged ice floes that threatened to crush the boats with every passing minute. Colonel Henry Knox, Washington's artillery commander, later described the crossing as nearly impossible. Men, horses, and 18 cannons all fighting to get across a river that seemed absolutely determined to kill them before the British ever got the chance. Many of the soldiers had no shoes at all. They wrapped rags around their feet, and as they marched the 9 miles toward Trenton through the storm, they left a trail of blood in the snow behind them. Some of the men were so weak from hunger and cold that 2 soldiers actually froze to death on the march, never even reaching the battlefield they had suffered so much to arrive at. And here is something most people don't know. The operation almost fell apart before it even started. 2 other American detachments were supposed to cross the river at different points to support the main assault. Both failed. The ice was simply too thick, the river too violent. Washington's force would be attacking completely alone, with no backup, hours behind schedule, in broad daylight instead of before dawn as originally planned. Any rational commander would have called the whole thing off right then and there. Washington did not. There is another detail from that crossing that rarely makes it into the history books. Among the men in those boats was a young captain named James Monroe, who would one day become the 5th President of the United States. He was wounded in the assault that followed, shot in the shoulder, and nearly bled to death on the battlefield before a doctor saved his life. Decades later, when a famous painting of the Delaware crossing was created, Monroe was placed right beside Washington, holding the flag, a quiet reminder that the men in those boats were not just soldiers. They were the future of a nation that did not exist yet. At around 8 in the morning on December 26th, hours later than planned but still catching the Hessians completely off guard, Washington's exhausted, half-frozen army stormed into Trenton in 2 columns, led by Generals Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, had actually been warned days earlier that an attack might be coming. He dismissed the warnings entirely. Legend says he was in the middle of a card game when the attack began, and shoved an unread warning note into his pocket without even opening it. Historians still debate that exact detail, but what is certain is that Rall simply did not believe the Americans were capable of something like this. The Americans struck with total surprise. Henry Knox's artillery was placed at the head of Trenton's 2 main streets, and American cannon fire tore through the Hessian ranks as they scrambled to form up in the open. Alexander Hamilton, then a young artillery captain barely in his 20s, helped direct the guns that shattered the Hessian defense before it could even organize a proper response. The fighting was fast, chaotic, and brutal, but it was over in less than an hour. Colonel Rall was mortally wounded trying to rally his men. Nearly the entire Hessian garrison was killed, wounded, or captured. American losses were almost unbelievably light, only a handful of men wounded, and none killed in the actual combat. 900 Hessian soldiers surrendered to an American army that, by every right, shouldn't have even made it across the river that night. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how lopsided this outcome really was. This was not a narrow win. This was a total, overwhelming victory achieved in under an hour, against professional soldiers who had a fearsome reputation across Europe and the colonies alike. The Hessians had been hired specifically because they were considered some of the most disciplined fighting men in the world. And in the span of about 45 minutes, an army of American volunteers who had marched all night through a blizzard, with frozen feet wrapped in rags, completely dismantled them. When word of the victory spread through the colonies in the days that followed, it was treated almost like a miracle. People who had given up on the revolution just weeks earlier suddenly found new hope. Newspapers printed the story with disbelief and pride. For the first time in months, ordinary Americans allowed themselves to believe that this war might actually be winnable. This was the moment America changed forever. Think about what Washington actually pulled off here. He crossed a deadly ice-choked river at night, in a blizzard, with an army that had no shoes, no supplies, and no real reason to believe in victory. He lost his support columns. He lost the element of a dawn attack, and he attacked anyway because he understood something his enemies didn't. Sometimes the boldest move is the only one that can actually save you. Against all odds, it worked. But Washington wasn't finished. In the days that followed, he pulled off an even more audacious move. Facing a British counterattack led by the formidable General Cornwallis at Trenton on January 2nd, Washington used the cover of night to slip his entire army around the British flank, leaving campfires burning to fool Cornwallis into thinking the Americans were still dug in right where they left them. The next morning, Cornwallis woke up to find the American army completely gone and marching toward Princeton instead. On January 3rd, 1777, Washington's forces clashed with British troops at Princeton, winning another stunning victory and further shattering the myth that the Continental Army was finished. In just 10 days, Washington had gone from a broken commander on the verge of losing the war to the architect of one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. British officers who had mocked the Americans as an army of untrained farmers were now forced to admit that Washington had outmaneuvered one of the most professional armies in the world, not through brute force, but through daring, deception, and sheer force of will. British General Cornwallis himself would later call Washington's campaign in New Jersey one of the most brilliant he had ever witnessed. Let that sink in. The enemy commander, the man sent to crush the rebellion once and for all, was left in awe of what these so-called amateur Americans had accomplished in just 10 winter days. Consider the sheer scale of what Washington had just done in a week and a half. He had crossed a deadly river in a blizzard with a starving army. He had won a lopsided victory at Trenton. He had then turned around, recrossed that same dangerous river, gone back into New Jersey to fight again, and outmaneuvered one of Britain's most respected generals, not with more men or more cannons, but with pure battlefield deception. Leaving the campfires burning at Trenton to fool Cornwallis was not just clever, it was a psychological masterstroke, the kind of decision that separates a good commander from a legendary one. When the British woke up the next morning to the sound of American cannon fire echoing from Princeton, miles away from where they thought Washington's army was sleeping, it must have felt like they were chasing a ghost. So what did these 10 days actually mean for the future of the country? The victories at Trenton and Princeton didn't win the Revolutionary War. There were still 6 brutal years of fighting ahead, filled with hardship, sacrifice, and uncertainty. But they saved the revolution from ending in December 1776. Washington's gamble reignited enlistments just as his army was about to disband entirely. It convinced Congress and the American people watching from home that this cause was not lost. It shattered the myth of Hessian and British invincibility that had haunted the colonies since the war began. And perhaps most importantly, it proved to skeptical foreign powers, especially France, that the Americans might actually be capable of winning this fight. That belief would eventually help bring French military support into the war, support that would prove absolutely decisive years later at Yorktown, where the British would finally surrender for good. None of that would have been possible without those 10 days in the New Jersey winter. Foreign diplomats in Paris and across Europe had been watching the American cause with polite curiosity, but very little real confidence. Most assumed the rebellion would collapse within the year, just as the British High Command did. News of Trenton and Princeton traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but when it arrived, it forced European observers to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this fight. An army that could vanish in the dead of night, cross a frozen river, destroy a garrison of feared mercenaries, and then outmaneuver a British general within the same week was clearly not an army on the verge of surrender. It was an army worth taking seriously, and eventually worth investing in. Historians today still call the 10 crucial days, from the Delaware crossing to the Battle of Princeton, one of the most important turning points in American history, not because of the size of the battles, which were small compared to what came later, but because of what they represented, that a small, determined force, led with brilliant judgment and unbreakable resolve, could stand up to the greatest empire on earth and win. It is easy, looking back from today, to assume the American Revolution was destined to succeed. But nothing about it was inevitable. If Washington had decided the river was too dangerous that Christmas night, if he had listened to the voices telling him to wait until spring, the Continental Army very likely would have dissolved within the week. There would have been no Valley Forge, no Yorktown, no United States Constitution, no nation for future generations to inherit. The entire future of American independence came down to one man's decision to trust his instincts on a freezing riverbank when every rational argument said to turn back. Washington didn't just win a battle that Christmas night. He saved the idea of America itself at the exact moment it was closest to disappearing forever. And that is the story of how 12 days in the dead of winter, on a frozen river, with an army that had every reason to quit, changed the entire course of history. Years later, long after independence had been won, and Washington had become the first president of the United States, artists and writers still return to that Christmas night crossing again and again, trying to capture what made it so powerful. Not because the battle itself was massive, but because it represented something deeply American. The idea that ordinary people, farmers, tradesmen, immigrants, and teenagers could rise up against the greatest power on earth and, through sheer courage and clever leadership, change the direction of history. That spirit did not end in 1776. It carried through Valley Forge, through Yorktown, and through every generation of Americans who would later be asked to stand up when the odds were stacked against them. That's the story of the impossible victory, the night America refused to die. It's a lesson that still matters today. It's not always the strongest army that wins. Sometimes it's the one willing to cross the river when everyone else says it can't be done. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you the greatest true stories of American courage every single week. And if you love this video, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Now I want to hear from you. What other American victory should I cover next? Drop it in the comments below. Yorktown, Midway, the defense of Bastogne? You decide. Thanks for watching, and remember, the story of America has always been the story of the impossible becoming reality.